The water ran red down the drain as Diana scrubbed the third body that morning, her calloused hands working methodically around the bullet wound in the stranger's chest. At $17 per corpse, she couldn't afford to be squeamish. The basement morgue of Whitmore Funeral Home had become her world, a place where the dead paid for her survival and the living rarely ventured after dark. But on that October night in 2019, when she felt warm fingers wrap around her wrist as she cleaned what she thought was just another lifeless body, Diana realized that some secrets were worth more than money and some debts could only be paid with the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Diana Martinez had always known the smell of formaldehyde. Growing up 3 blocks from Whitmore Funeral Home in the industrial district of Gary, Indiana, the chemical tang had become as familiar as the rust-stained air from the nearby steel mills. What she hadn't expected was that this smell would become the scent of salvation. The October rain hammered against the basement windows of the funeral home as Diana pulled on her third pair of rubber gloves that evening. Her supervisor, Edmund Whitmore Jr., had left hours ago, trusting her with the keys to the preparation room and the combination to the cash box where he left her daily wages. $17 per body, cash, no questions asked, no paperwork filed with the state. It wasn't legal, but legality was a luxury Diana couldn't afford. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the stainless steel. And tables. 3 bodies waited for her attention tonight. An elderly woman who had died peacefully in her sleep, a middle-aged construction worker who had suffered a heart attack on the job, and a young man who had arrived that afternoon with what looked like gang-related injuries. Diana started with the elderly woman, Mrs. Catherine Holloway, according to the toe tag. The process was methodical. Remove any jewelry or personal items, wash the body thoroughly with antibacterial soap, paying special attention to the hands and face, then apply the preliminary embalming fluid that would keep the body presentable, until the official embalming the next morning. It was gruesome work, but Diana had developed a mental compartmentalization that allowed her to see each body as a problem to solve, rather than a person who had once lived and breathed. Mrs. Holloway had been easy, natural death, no visible trauma, just the simple washing and preparation that came with age-related passing. Diana worked efficiently, her movements practiced from 6 months of nightly work in the basement. The elderly woman's wedding ring had been loose enough to slide off easily, and Diana set it carefully in the small plastic bag that would be returned to the family. The construction worker proved more challenging. Marcus Thompson, age 43, had died of massive cardiac arrest while operating a crane at the Midwest Steel plant. His hands were permanently stained with grease and oil, requiring extra scrubbing to make them presentable for viewing. Diana worked the industrial soap into his palms, using a stiff brush to clean under his fingernails. The calluses on his hands reminded her of her own father's hands before he had disappeared when she was 12. As she worked, Diana's mind wandered to her current situation. The $17 per body was barely enough to cover her portion of the rent for the studio apartment she shared with her mother, Sarah Martinez, who had been battling prescription drug addiction since a factory accident 3 years earlier. Sarah's disability checks covered most of their basic expenses, but the cost of her mother's pills, the ones not covered by their meager insurance, ate through their budget like acid through metal. Diana had tried legitimate work. She had applied at every fast food restaurant, retail store, and service business within walking distance of their apartment. But at 19, with only a GED and no reliable transportation, her options were limited. The few places that had been willing to hire her offered minimum wage for daytime hours, which conflicted with her need to care for her mother during Sarah's worst withdrawal episodes. The job at Whitmore Funeral Home had fallen into her lap through Marcus Rodriguez, a regular at the corner store where she occasionally picked up groceries. Marcus worked part-time as a groundskeeper at the cemetery adjacent to the funeral home, and had overheard Edmund Whitmore Jr. complaining about the difficulty of finding reliable help for the night shift preparation work. The job requirements were simple: show up on time, follow basic sanitation procedures, and maintain absolute discretion about everything she saw or heard. Edmund Whitmore Jr. was a third-generation funeral director who had inherited both the business and its mounting financial problems. The neighborhood had been in decline for over a decade, and the funeral home was struggling to compete with the larger corporate chains that had moved into the area. Edmund's solution was to cut corners wherever possible, including hiring unofficial help for the preliminary body preparation work that didn't require a license. Diana finished with Marcus Thompson and moved to the third table. The young man's toe tag read James Mitchell, aged 24. Unlike the previous two bodies, James Mitchell's cause of death was immediately apparent: 3 bullet wounds, 2 in the chest, and 1 in the abdomen. The police report attached to his paperwork indicated that he had been found in an alley behind a convenience store on the south side of Gary, apparently the victim of a robbery gone wrong. Working on gunshot victims always made Diana more nervous. The violence of their deaths seemed to linger around the bodies, creating an atmosphere of unease that she couldn't shake. She had learned to work quickly on trauma victims, completing the basic cleaning and preparation as efficiently as possible before her imagination could conjure up scenarios about their final moments. James Mitchell had been young, probably close to her own age. His driver's license, found in his wallet, showed an address in a slightly better part of town. According to the paperwork, he had been working as a delivery driver for a local restaurant chain. Diana wondered if he had been making a late-night delivery when he encountered his killer, or if he had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. As she began cleaning the bullet wounds, Diana noticed something unusual. Unlike most gunshot victims she had worked on, James Mitchell's injuries appeared to have been inflicted at close range. The powder burns around the wounds suggested that whoever had shot him had been standing very close, perhaps close enough to have been someone he knew and trusted. The first wound, just below his left collarbone, had been the kill shot. The bullet had traveled downward at an angle that suggested the shooter had been taller than James, or that James had been kneeling when the shot was fired. The second chest wound appeared to be more defensive in nature, possibly inflicted while James was trying to protect himself or escape. The abdominal wound was the most puzzling. It was positioned in a way that would have caused maximum pain and bleeding without immediately killing him. Diana had seen enough gunshot victims to recognize the difference between a quick robbery, shooting, and something more personal. The pattern of James Mitchell's wounds suggested torture or execution rather than a simple crime of opportunity. She wondered if the police had reached the same conclusion, or if they had simply classified it as another street crime statistic. As she worked, Diana found herself studying James Mitchell's face. Even in death, he had an honest, open expression that reminded her of her younger brother Tommy, who had enlisted in the army immediately after high school to escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped their family. James had the same kind of hopeful features, the look of someone who had believed that hard work and good intentions would be enough to build a decent life. The bullet wounds required more extensive cleaning than usual. Diana had to flush each wound channel with saline solution to remove any debris or blood clots that might have formed during the hours between death and arrival at the funeral home. The process was tedious and unpleasant, but necessary to prevent decomposition and odor during the viewing period. As she worked on the abdominal wound, Diana noticed something that made her pause. Embedded in the tissue around the bullet hole was what appeared to be a small piece of fabric, Not from James's clothing, but something different. She carefully extracted it with tweezers and examined it under the bright preparation light. The fabric was expensive-looking, possibly silk, and deep burgundy in color. It didn't match anything James had been wearing when his body was discovered. Diana had been specifically instructed never to remove anything from the bodies beyond standard jewelry and personal effects. Edmund Whitmore Jr. had emphasized that any evidence related to ongoing investigations should remain undisturbed until the medical examiner completed their work. But the police had already released the body for burial, which meant their investigation was considered complete. She held the small piece of fabric up to the light, wondering if she should mention it to Edmund in the morning. The fabric appeared to have been torn from a larger garment, possibly during a struggle. If it belonged to the killer, it could be important evidence. But Diana also knew that reopening a closed case would likely result in unwanted attention for the funeral home and possibly the end of her off-the-books employment. The decision was made for her when she heard the distinct sound of the basement door opening upstairs. Edmund never returned to the funeral home after hours unless there was an emergency, and he would have called ahead to let her know he was coming. Diana quickly pocketed the fabric sample and continued working, trying to appear busy with routine preparation tasks. Footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs leading down to the preparation room. They were heavy, deliberate steps that didn't match Edmund's usual hurried pace. Diana felt her pulse quicken as she realized that whoever was coming down the stairs was trying to be quiet, placing their feet carefully to minimize noise. She glanced toward the preparation room door, which she had left unlocked, as was her usual practice. Edmund had given her specific instructions never to lock herself in the basement, both for safety reasons and because he occasionally needed to access supplies during his evening administrative work upstairs. Now she wished she had ignored those instructions. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. Diana continued working on James Mitchell's body, hoping that whoever was upstairs would assume the basement was empty and leave. She had positioned herself so that she could see the door in her peripheral vision while appearing to be focused on her work. A shadow moved across the frosted glass panel in the preparation room door. Someone was standing just outside, apparently listening for sounds of activity. Diana held her breath and tried to remain perfectly still, hoping the intruder would conclude that the basement was empty. The door handle turned slowly, and the door opened just wide enough for someone to peer inside. Diana couldn't see who. It was without turning her head, but she could sense someone watching her work. The presence felt malevolent, predatory, as if the watcher was evaluating her as a potential threat or obstacle. After what felt like an eternity, the door closed again, and the footsteps moved away from the preparation room. But instead of heading back upstairs, they moved deeper into the basement, toward the storage areas where Edmund kept older records and unused equipment. Diana realized that whoever had broken into the funeral home wasn't looking for money or valuable supplies. They were searching for something specific. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The sound of boxes being moved and papers being shuffled drifted through the basement walls. Whoever was conducting the search was being systematic, but not particularly careful about concealing their presence. Diana wondered if they knew she was in the building, or if they assumed the preparation room was empty because of the late hour. She continued working on James Mitchell's body, using the routine tasks as a way to calm her nerves and maintain the pretense of normalcy. If the intruder discovered her presence, she wanted to appear as non-threatening as possible, just a minimum-wage employee doing her job, not someone who might have witnessed something important. The searching continued for nearly 20 minutes. Drawers were opened and closed, file cabinets were examined, and storage boxes were moved and replaced. It sounded like whoever was conducting the search knew exactly what they were looking for and had a good idea of where it might be located. Finally, the sound stopped. Diana heard the footsteps returning toward the stairs, moving more quickly. Now. The basement door opened and closed, and then the building returned to its usual nighttime silence. She waited another 10 minutes before allowing herself to relax, just in case the intruder was still in the building or watching from outside. When she was confident that she was alone again, Diana moved to the small basement window and peered out into the parking lot. A dark sedan was pulling away from the building, its headlights off despite the rainy conditions. She couldn't see the license plate or identify the make and model, but she made a mental note of the vehicle's general size and shape. The incident had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. In 6 months of working at the funeral home, she had never encountered anything more threatening than an occasional drunk who had wandered into the building looking for shelter. The idea that someone would break in to search for something specific suggested that the funeral home was involved in activities more complicated than simple burial services. Diana returned to her work, but her concentration was broken. She found herself glancing toward the door every few minutes and jumping at every small sound from the building's aging infrastructure. The piece of fabric she had found in James Mitchell's wound felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket, and she began to wonder if there was a connection between the fabric and the late-night search. As she completed the preparation of James Mitchell's body, Diana made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life. Instead of leaving the fabric sample on the preparation table for Edmund to find in the morning, she wrapped it carefully in a clean paper towel and tucked it into her jacket pocket. If someone was willing to break into the funeral home to search for evidence related to James Mitchell's death, that evidence might be valuable enough to improve her desperate financial situation. The thought made her feel guilty. She was essentially stealing evidence from a crime scene and potentially interfering with justice for a young man who had died violently. But Diana's sense of moral obligation was overwhelmed by her practical need for money and her growing suspicion that the official investigation into James Mitchell's death had been deliberately incomplete. She finished her work on all 3 bodies and began the cleanup process. The preparation room had to be spotless before she left, with all instruments sterilized and all surfaces disinfected. Edmund had emphasized that any contamination or unsanitary conditions could result in health department citations that would threaten the funeral home's license. As she cleaned, Diana thought about her options. She could pretend that the break-in had never happened, complete her shift as usual, and hope that whatever the intruder had been seeking was unrelated to her work. Or she could try to learn more about James Mitchell and the circumstances of his death, possibly using the fabric sample as leverage to extract information or payment from whoever was responsible for the cover-up. The second option was dangerous, but potentially lucrative. Diana had grown up in a neighborhood where information was currency and secrets were commodities to be bought and sold. She had learned from an early age how to recognize when adults were lying or hiding something important, and she had developed an instinct for identifying opportunities in other people's desperation. By the time she finished cleaning the preparation room, Diana had made her decision. She would keep the fabric sample and begin her own investigation into James Mitchell's death. If she could identify the killer or uncover evidence of a conspiracy, that information would be worth far more than $17 per corpse. She locked the funeral home and walked home through the empty streets of Gary, Indiana, the fabric sample secure in her pocket and her mind already working on a plan. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of moisture and industrial chemicals. The streetlights cast long shadows between the abandoned buildings and empty lots that dominated the neighborhood. Diana's studio apartment was on the third floor of a converted warehouse building. The elevator had been broken for over a year, so she climbed the stairs quietly to avoid waking her mother. Sarah Martinez had been having a particularly difficult week with her medication, and Diana didn't want to trigger another episode by coming home too late or appearing agitated. The apartment was dark and quiet when she entered. Her mother was asleep on the fold-out couch that served as their living room furniture during the day and Sarah's bed at night. Diana had given up the apartment's single bedroom to her mother, preferring to sleep on an air mattress in the corner of the main room. She changed out of her work clothes and washed her hands thoroughly, but the smell of formaldehyde and disinfectant seemed to cling to her skin, regardless of how much soap she used. The fabric sample was now hidden in a small jewelry box that had belonged to her grandmother, tucked away behind a stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. As she tried to fall asleep on the air mattress, Diana's mind raced with possibilities and concerns. She'd crossed a line tonight by taking evidence from a crime scene, and there was no going back. Whatever happened next, she was now personally invested in uncovering the truth about James Mitchell's death. The last thing she remembered before falling asleep was the feeling of those warm fingers around her wrist, as if James Mitchell's body had been trying to tell her something important. In her dreams, the dead young man sat up on the preparation table and whispered warnings about the dangers of curiosity and the price of justice in a city where both were expensive luxuries that few could afford. The next morning brought new complications that Diana couldn't have anticipated. She arrived at the funeral home for her regular evening shift to find Edmund Whitmore Jr. waiting for her with a grim expression and a stack of police reports spread across his desk. "We need to talk," Edmund said before she could even hang up. Her jacket. "There was a break-in last night, and I have some questions about what you might have seen or heard." Diana felt her stomach drop, but she forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. "I didn't see anyone break in," she said, which was technically true since she hadn't actually seen the intruder, only heard them searching the basement. Edmund studied her face carefully. "The police think whoever broke in was looking for something specific. They went through the old files and storage areas, but didn't touch any of the expensive equipment or supplies. That suggests they knew exactly what they wanted and where to find it." "What could someone want from a funeral home?" Diana asked, trying to sound genuinely curious rather than defensive. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Edmund replied. "The only thing that makes sense is that they were looking for information about one of our recent cases, something that might be connected to an ongoing investigation or legal proceeding." Diana nodded thoughtfully, as if she was considering the possibilities for the first time. "Did they find whatever they were looking for?" Edmund's expression darkened. "That's the problem. I don't know what they were looking for, so I can't tell if they found it. But I have a feeling that last night's break-in won't be the end of our troubles." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Lisa Warren from the Gary Police Department. Detective Warren was a tall, angular woman in her 40s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from years of investigating violent crimes in a city with limited resources and unlimited problems. "Mr. Whitmore," Detective Warren said, nodding politely to Edmund before turning her attention to Diana, "and you must be the night shift worker I've been hearing about. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what you might have observed last night." Diana felt her pulse quicken, but she maintained eye contact with the detective. "I was working in the preparation room most of the night. I heard some sounds from other parts of the building, but I assumed it was just Mr. Whitmore doing administrative work upstairs." "What kind of sounds?" Detective Warren asked, pulling out a small notebook and pen. "Footsteps, doors opening and closing, that sort of thing. Nothing that seemed unusual at the time." Detective Warren made a few notes. "Did you see anyone entering or leaving the building? Any vehicles in the parking lot that didn't belong?" "I saw a dark car leaving when I looked out the window around midnight, but I couldn't tell you what kind it was or who was driving. The detective nodded and continued taking notes. I understand you work on body preparation. Have you noticed anything unusual about any of the recent cases? Anything that might suggest someone would want to access the files or records? This was the moment Diana had been dreading. She could feel the fabric sample in her pocket like a lead weight, and she was certain that Detective Warren would somehow sense that she was hiding something important. But she also knew that admitting to taking evidence from a crime scene would result in immediate arrest and the end of her employment. Nothing unusual, she said, hoping her voice sounded steady. Most of the bodies I work on are pretty straightforward. Natural deaths, accidents, that kind of thing. Detective Warren studied her for a long moment. What about James Mitchell, the gunshot victim who came in yesterday? Did you notice anything unusual about his case? Diana felt sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cool temperature in Edmund's office. He had multiple gunshot wounds, which was sad, but not unusual for this neighborhood. I just did the basic cleaning and preparation work. Did you remove any items from the body, or notice any evidence that might be relevant to the investigation? Just his wallet and jewelry, which I gave to Mr. Whitmore, like always. Detective Warren nodded and closed her notebook. If you think of anything else, or if you notice any other unusual activity around the funeral home, please call me immediately. She handed Diana a business card with her contact information. After the detective left, Edmund assigned Diana to work on a new set of bodies that had arrived that afternoon. 2 natural deaths and 1 apparent suicide. Routine work that would normally help her clear her head and focus on practical concerns. But tonight, every sound from other parts of the building made her jump, and she found herself constantly glancing toward the door. As she worked, Diana thought about Detective Warren's questions and her own responses. The detective had seemed particularly interested in James Mitchell's case, which suggested that there might be more to his death than a simple robbery gone wrong. The fact that someone had broken into the funeral home the night after James's body arrived was probably not a coincidence. The fabric sample in her pocket felt like it was getting heavier with each passing hour. Diana knew she should have given it to Detective Warren, but she also sensed that the official investigation was missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. If she could figure out what those pieces were and how they fit together, the information might be valuable enough to change her life. Around 2 a.m., Diana made another decision that would have far-reaching consequences. She used her phone to take photographs of James Mitchell's paperwork, including the police report and the medical examiner's preliminary findings. The documents were supposed to remain confidential, but Edmund often left case files scattered around the preparation room while he worked on funeral arrangements. The police report contained several details that hadn't been mentioned in Detective Warren's questions. James Mitchell had been found with his hands bound behind his back, suggesting that he had been restrained before being shot. His wallet was missing, but his expensive watch and gold chain was still on his body, which seemed inconsistent with a robbery motive. Most interesting of all, the report noted that James Mitchell had called 911 approximately 30 minutes before his body was discovered, but the call had been disconnected before he could speak to a dispatcher. The phone had been found at the scene, but its screen was cracked and its memory corrupted beyond recovery. Diana realized that she was looking at evidence of a professional execution disguised as a street crime. Someone had wanted James Mitchell dead, and they had been willing to go to considerable lengths to make his death appear random and motiveless. The break-in at the funeral home suggested that whoever was responsible was concerned about evidence that might contradict the official narrative. She finished her work on the night's bodies and began the cleanup process, but her mind was focused on developing a strategy for leveraging her knowledge into something more valuable than minimum wage work. The fabric sample was important, but it was only useful if she could connect it to a specific person or organization. As Diana locked up the funeral home and walked home through the pre-dawn darkness, she began to formulate a plan that would require her to step deeper into a world she didn't fully understand. She would need to learn more about James Mitchell's life and work, identify his associates and enemies, and figure out why someone had considered him dangerous enough to kill. The plan was risky, potentially fatal, but it offered the possibility of escape from the cycle of poverty and desperation that had defined her entire life. For the first time since her father's disappearance 7 years earlier, Diana felt like she might have some control over her own destiny. What she didn't know was that her decision to investigate James Mitchell's death had already been noticed by people who had invested considerable resources in keeping that death classified as a solved case. The fabric sample in her pocket was more than just evidence. It was a thread that, if pulled carefully, would unravel a conspiracy involving corruption, murder, and millions of dollars in illegal profits. The warm fingers that would soon wrap around her wrist in the funeral home's basement were attached to someone who had been waiting patiently for the right person to discover the truth about his death. James Mitchell's story was far from over, and Diana Martinez was about to become the most important character in its final chapters. 3 days after photographing James Mitchell's case files, Diana found herself standing outside Rosario's Pizza, on the south side of Gary, watching delivery drivers load their cars with insulated bags. According to the employment records she had glimpsed in the police report, this was where James had worked during the final months of his life. The restaurant occupied a narrow storefront between a check-cashing business and a vacant lot overgrown, with weeds. Hand-painted signs in English and Spanish advertised daily specials, and the smell of garlic and oregano drifted through the cracked front door. It was the kind of neighborhood establishment that survived on loyal local customers and cash transactions. Diana had spent the previous 2 days researching everything she could find about James Mitchell online. His social media profiles painted the picture of a young man trying to build a legitimate life in a city that offered few opportunities. He had posted photos of himself making deliveries, always smiling, often joking about the challenges of navigating Gary's pothole-riddled streets and finding addresses in neighborhoods where street signs had been stolen or vandalized. What struck Diana most about James's online presence was his optimism. Despite working a minimum wage job in one of America's most economically devastated cities, his posts were full of plans for the future. He had been saving money to enroll in community college classes, hoping to study automotive repair. He had mentioned wanting to eventually open his own garage, specializing in restoring classic cars. The contrast between James's hopeful social media posts and the brutal reality of his death made Diana more determined to uncover the truth. Someone had decided that this young man's dreams were worth ending, and she was beginning to suspect that the motive had nothing to do with robbery or random street violence. She pushed open the door to Rosario's Pizza and immediately felt the blast of hot air from the ovens. The interior was small and cramped, with a few plastic tables for customers who preferred to eat in rather than order takeout. Behind the counter, a heavy-set woman in her 50s was arguing in rapid Spanish with the younger man who appeared to be one of the delivery drivers. "Excuse me," Diana said when the argument paused. "I'm looking for information about James Mitchell. I understand he used to work here." The woman behind the counter, who wore a name tag identifying her as Maria Rosario, immediately became suspicious. "Are you the police? I already talked to the police. I told them everything I know." "I'm not a policeman," Diana said carefully. "I work at the funeral home where James's body was taken. I'm just trying to understand what happened to him." Maria studied Diana's face for a long moment, apparently trying to decide whether to trust her. "James was a good boy," she finally said. "He always showed up on time, never gave me any trouble. What happened to him was wrong." "Can you tell me about his last few weeks here? Did he seem worried about anything or mention any problems he was having?" The delivery driver, who had been arguing with Maria, suddenly became very interested in the conversation. He was a thin young man with nervous eyes and the kind of restless energy that suggested either drug use or chronic anxiety. "You asking about James?" he said, moving closer to the counter. "James was into some heavy stuff before he died, stuff that got him killed." Maria shot the young man a warning look. "Miguel, shut your mouth. You don't know what you're talking about." But Miguel seemed eager to share what he knew. James was making extra money on the side, taking special deliveries for cash. Big money, too. He bought new clothes, started talking about getting his own place. But then he got scared about something and tried to quit. "What kind of special deliveries?" Diana asked. Miguel glanced nervously at Maria, who was glaring at him with obvious disapproval. "Look, I don't know all the details, but word on the street is that James was delivering more than pizza to certain addresses, and when he tried to stop, somebody made sure he couldn't talk about what he'd seen." Maria crossed her arms over her chest. "Miguel, if you don't stop running your mouth, you're going to end up just like James. Some things are better left alone." The warning sent a chill down Diana's spine. She realized that she had stumbled into something much more dangerous than a simple murder investigation. If James Mitchell had been involved in drug dealing or some other illegal activity, the people responsible for his death would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who asked too many questions. But instead of deterring her, the danger only made Diana more determined to uncover the truth. She had lived in fear of poverty and helplessness for most of her life, and the prospect of finally having some control over her circumstances was intoxicating, even if it came with significant risks. "Did James ever mention any specific names or addresses for these special deliveries?" she asked Miguel. Before he could answer, Maria intervened forcefully. "That's enough. Miguel, get back to work. And you," she said, pointing at Diana, "you need to leave. Now." As Diana walked back toward the bus stop, she felt someone following her. She turned around and saw Miguel hurrying to catch up, glancing nervously over his shoulder to make sure. Maria wasn't watching from the restaurant window. "Hey, wait up," he called softly. "I want to help you find out what happened to James, but I can't talk about it in front of Maria. She's scared that if word gets out about the special deliveries, the restaurant will get shut down or worse." Diana stopped and waited for Miguel to reach her. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, probably still in his teens. His nervousness was more pronounced now that they were away from Maria's protective presence. "What can you tell me about these special deliveries?" Diana asked. Miguel looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "James never told me exactly what he was delivering, but it wasn't food. The packages were small, usually wrapped in brown paper, and the customers always paid cash. Big bills too, 50s and 100s. How often did he make these deliveries? Maybe 2 or 3 times a week, always to the same few addresses. James said the money was too good to pass up, even though he knew it was risky. But then, about 2 weeks before he died, something changed. He started acting paranoid, looking over his shoulder all the time, jumping when his phone rang." Miguel paused and pulled out a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly as he lit it. "The last time I talked to James, he told me he had decided to quit the special deliveries. He said he had found out something that made him realize how dangerous the situation was, and he was going to go to the police." The revelation hit Diana like a physical blow. If James Mitchell had been planning to cooperate with law enforcement, his murder wasn't just about eliminating a drug courier. It was about silencing a potential witness to something much larger. Did he tell you what he had found out? Diana asked. Not exactly, but he mentioned something about recognizing someone who was supposed to be on the other side of the law. James said he realized that the people he thought were criminals and the people he thought were protecting the community were sometimes the same people. Miguel took a long drag on his cigarette and exhaled slowly. Look, I like James, but I'm not trying to end up dead like him. If you're smart, you'll drop this whole thing and forget about whatever it is you think you're going to find. With that warning, Miguel flicked his cigarette into the street and walked quickly back toward the restaurant, leaving Diana standing alone at the bus stop with more questions than answers. The bus ride back to her neighborhood gave Diana time to process what she had learned. James Mitchell had been involved in some kind of delivery operation that was lucrative enough to tempt a minimum wage worker, dangerous enough to require secrecy, and connected to corruption that reached into law enforcement. His decision to become a whistleblower had cost him his life, but Diana still didn't understand how the fabric sample she had found in James's wound fit into the larger picture. The expensive-looking burgundy material suggested that whoever had killed James was wealthy enough to afford high-quality clothing, which seemed inconsistent with the street-level drug dealing that Miguel had described. As the bus pulled into her stop, Diana made a decision that would prove to be both the most dangerous and most important choice of her life. Instead of going home to her mother's apartment, she walked to the Gary Public Library and used one of their computers to begin researching the addresses where James had made his special deliveries. The library's internet connection was slow and unreliable, but Diana had learned to be patient with technology that didn't always work properly. She started by looking up property records for the addresses that Miguel had mentioned, trying to identify the owners and any businesses that might be operating from those locations. What she found surprised her. Instead of the run-down drug houses or illegal gambling operations she had expected, James's delivery routes had taken him to some of the most expensive addresses in the Gary metropolitan area. One address was registered to a law firm that specialized in municipal contracts. Another belonged to a real estate development company that had been involved in several major construction projects funded by federal grants. The third address was the most interesting of all. It was registered to Detective Lisa Warren, the same police officer who had questioned Diana about the break-in at the funeral home. The discovery sent Diana's mind racing with new possibilities and concerns. If Detective Warren was connected to James Mitchell's illegal delivery operation, her involvement in investigating his murder represented a massive conflict of interest. It might also explain why the official investigation had been closed so quickly, and why someone had been desperate enough to break into the funeral home looking for additional evidence. Diana printed out the property records and address information, using some of her limited cash to pay the library's printing fees. As she walked home through the evening darkness, she tried to figure out her next move. Confronting Detective Warren directly would be suicide if the police officer was involved in James's murder. But finding more evidence would require taking risks that could easily get her killed. When she arrived at her apartment, Diana found her mother, Sarah, sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a pile of overdue bills and collection notices. Sarah's hands were shaking slightly, a sign that she was approaching the time for her next dose of prescription medication. "How was work today?" Sarah asked without looking up from the bills. "Fine," Diana replied, not wanting to worry her mother with details about her investigation. "Did you eat dinner?" Sarah nodded toward a half-empty can of soup on the counter. "I wasn't very hungry. These bills are getting worse every month. The electric company is threatening to shut us off if we don't pay something by Friday." Diana felt the familiar weight of financial pressure settling on her shoulders. The $17 per night from the funeral home was barely covering their basic expenses, and her mother's prescription costs were increasing as her tolerance built up and she required higher doses to manage her chronic pain. "I might have found a way to make some extra money," Diana said carefully, "but it would involve taking on some additional responsibilities at work." Sarah looked up with a mixture of hope and concern. "What kind of additional responsibilities? You're already working nights, and you need to be careful about taking on too much. Just some research and administrative work. Nothing dangerous or illegal." It was a lie, but Diana couldn't bring herself to tell her mother that she was planning to investigate a murder conspiracy that might involve corrupt police officers and organized crime. Sarah had enough problems without worrying that her daughter was about to get herself killed pursuing a dangerous amateur investigation. That night, Diana lay awake on her air mattress, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the choices she faced. She could abandon her investigation, return the fabric sample to the funeral home, and continue working for $17 per night while her mother's condition deteriorated and their financial situation became increasingly desperate. Or she could continue pursuing the truth about James Mitchell's death, knowing that the investigation might lead to discoveries that would put her own life in danger. The decision was made easier by the sound of her mother coughing in the next room, a harsh, painful sound that had been getting worse over the past few weeks. Sarah's prescription insurance only covered the cheapest generic medications, which were less effective than the name-brand alternatives her doctor had recommended. The difference in monthly cost was only about $200, but it might as well have been $2 million, given their current financial situation. Diana reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the small piece of burgundy fabric that had started her down this path. In the dim light from the street lamp outside their window, the material looked almost black, but she could still see the quality of the weave and the richness of the color. This small piece of cloth was her ticket to a different life, if she was brave enough and smart enough to figure out how to use it. The next evening, Diana arrived at the funeral home with a plan that would require her to take bigger risks than she had ever imagined. She waited until Edmund Whitmore Jr. had left for the night, then used his computer to access the funeral home's client database. She was looking for any other cases that might be connected to James Mitchell's death or the corruption network that had apparently cost him his life. What she found in the database made her realize that James Mitchell was not the only victim of what appeared to be a systematic campaign to eliminate potential witnesses. Over the past 6 months, the funeral home had processed the bodies of at least 4 other young men who had died under suspicious circumstances, all of whom had been classified as victims of street crime or drug-related violence. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable once Diana knew what to look for. All of the victims had been employed in legitimate jobs that would have given them access to information about illegal activities. Delivery drivers, security guards, maintenance workers, and other positions that required them to move through the city and observe what was happening in different neighborhoods. More importantly, all of their cases had been investigated by Detective Lisa Warren, and all had been closed quickly with minimal follow-up investigation. The official reports consistently concluded that the deaths were the result of robbery, drug deals gone wrong, or other random street violence. But Diana was beginning to understand that there was nothing random about any of these deaths. Someone was systematically eliminating people who might have witnessed or learned about illegal activities involving corruption, drug dealing, or other organized crime. The killer was sophisticated enough to make each death appear unconnected to the others, but careless enough to have left physical evidence at least one crime scene. As Diana worked on that night's bodies, 2 natural deaths and 1 apparent accident victim, she began to formulate a plan that would either make her rich enough to solve all her financial problems or get her killed in the process. She was going to use the fabric sample as leverage to extract money from whoever had killed James Mitchell, but she would need to be extremely careful about how she made contact with the guilty parties. The plan required her to take one more significant risk. At the end of her shift, instead of going directly home, Diana drove to Detective Warren's address using Edmund's funeral home vehicle, which she was technically authorized to use for emergency transportation of bodies or supplies. Detective Warren lived in a suburban neighborhood that was much nicer than anything Diana had ever seen up close. The houses were large and well-maintained, with professional landscaping and expensive cars in the driveways. Warren's house was particularly impressive, a two-story colonial with a three-car garage and what appeared to be a swimming pool. In the backyard, the house was dark except for a few security lights, but Diana could see a dark sedan in the driveway that matched the general description of the vehicle she had seen leaving the funeral home after the break-in. She parked across the street and used her phone to take photographs of the house, the car, and the license plate number. As she prepared to leave, Diana noticed movement in one of the upstairs windows. Someone was watching her from behind partially. Closed blinds. She started the funeral home van and drove away quickly, but not before the watcher had probably gotten a clear view of the vehicle and possibly her license plate number. The surveillance had been riskier than she had planned, but it had provided crucial confirmation that Detective Warren was indeed connected to the break-in at the funeral home. The next step would be to figure out how to use that information to her advantage without getting herself killed in the process. As Diana drove home through the empty streets of Gary, she didn't notice the dark sedan that had pulled out of Detective Warren's driveway and was following her at a discreet distance. The watchers had become the watched, and the amateur investigation that had begun with a small piece of fabric was about to take a turn that would put Diana in more danger than she could possibly imagine. The funeral home felt different when Diana arrived for her shift the next evening. Edmund Whitmore Jr. was still in his office when she clocked in, which was unusual. He typically left before sunset to avoid the neighborhood's more dangerous nighttime hours. Through his half-open door, she could hear him speaking in hushed tones on the telephone, his voice tense with barely controlled anxiety. "I don't care what your investigation revealed," Edmund was saying. "I run a legitimate business here, and I won't have it turned into some kind of crime scene. If you people can't keep your problems away from my establishment, then maybe we need to reconsider our arrangement." Diana pretended to organize supplies in the hallway while straining to hear more of the conversation. She had never heard Edmund speak with such authority or anger. Normally he was a nervous, apologetic man who seemed overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing his family's struggling business. "No, absolutely not," Edmund continued. "I've already told you everything I know about the break-in. My employee didn't see anything, and there's nothing missing from our files. Whatever you people are looking for, it's not here." The conversation ended abruptly, and Diana heard Edmund slam the phone down with unusual force. She quickly moved away from his office door and busied herself with preparing the night's workspace. A few minutes later, Edmund emerged from his office wearing his coat and carrying a briefcase. "Diana," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I need you to be extra careful tonight. There have been some complications with one of our recent cases, and we might have unwanted visitors again. If anyone shows up who isn't supposed to be here, call me immediately, and then call the police." "What kind of complications?" Diana asked, trying to sound concerned but not overly curious. Edmund hesitated, apparently weighing how much information to share with her. "Let's just say that some people aren't satisfied with the official conclusions about certain deaths in our community. They seem to think that funeral homes keep more detailed records than we actually do." He handed her a new cell phone. a basic flip phone that looked like it had been purchased specifically for this purpose. "Keep this with you at all times. It has my number programmed in, and it will work even if the landlines go down. If anything happens tonight, use this phone instead of the regular phones in the building." After Edmund left, Diana examined the phone more carefully. It was the kind of untraceable burner phone typically used by people who needed to communicate without leaving electronic records. The fact that Edmund had given her such a device suggested that he was more involved in whatever was happening than his nervous demeanor indicated. The night's work consisted of 3 bodies: an elderly man who had died of complications from diabetes, a middle-aged woman who had suffered a stroke, and a young woman named Patricia Gomez, who had allegedly died in a car accident. The first 2 cases were routine, but Patricia Gomez's file immediately caught Diana's attention. According to the police report, Patricia had been driving alone on a rural road outside Gary when her car left the roadway and struck a tree. The impact had killed her instantly, and there were no witnesses to the accident. But as Diana examined Patricia's body, she noticed several details that seemed inconsistent with the official story. The injuries were wrong for a frontal collision. Patricia had extensive bruising on her back and sides, suggesting that she had been beaten before the supposed accident. More troubling, there were ligature marks on her wrists that indicated she had been restrained with rope or zip ties. The medical examiner had noted these injuries in the autopsy report, but had attributed them to the force of the crash and the victim's struggles to free herself from the wreckage. But Diana had seen enough accident victims to recognize the difference between crash injuries and deliberate violence. Patricia Gomez had been murdered, and someone had staged the car accident to cover up the crime. The realization sent a chill through Diana as she understood that she was looking at another victim of the same conspiracy that had killed James Mitchell. As she worked on Patricia's body, Diana noticed something that made her heart race with both excitement and terror. Caught in Patricia's hair, so small that the medical examiner had missed it, was another piece of the same burgundy fabric she had found on James Mitchell. The killer was becoming careless, or perhaps he was deliberately leaving calling cards to intimidate anyone who might be investigating his crimes. Diana carefully extracted the fabric sample and compared it to the piece she had taken from James's body. The material was identical, the same weave, the same color, even what appeared to be the same tear pattern along the edges. Whoever had killed both victims had been wearing the same garment, or at least clothing made from the same expensive fabric. The discovery confirmed what Diana had begun to suspect. The deaths of James Mitchell, Patricia Gomez, and probably several other victims were connected by more than just Detective Warren's investigations. They were the work of a single killer who was sophisticated enough to make each death appear unrelated to the others, but careless enough to leave physical evidence at multiple crime scenes. As midnight approached, Diana found herself working alone in the funeral home's basement with 3 prepared bodies and a growing sense that she was being watched. The building's old heating system created constant background noise, creaking pipes settling wood, and the occasional bang from the ancient furnace. But tonight every sound seemed amplified and potentially threatening. She had just finished cleaning her instruments when the lights went out. The basement plunged into absolute darkness, and Diana's first thought was that the electric company had finally followed through on their threat to shut off power for non-payment. But the emergency lighting system should have been activated automatically, and the digital displays on the refrigeration units should have remained illuminated by their battery backup systems. Someone had deliberately cut power to the building. Diana reached for the cell phone Edmund had given her, but before she could flip it open, she heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Heavy, deliberate steps that belonged to someone who knew the building's layout and was comfortable moving through it in complete darkness. She crouched behind one of the preparation tables and tried to control her breathing. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, apparently listening for sounds of activity in the basement. Diana could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, and she was certain that whoever was searching for her would be able to hear it as well. A flashlight beam swept across the basement, methodically searching each corner and workstation. The light moved slowly and systematically, suggesting that the intruder was in no hurry and confident that he wouldn't be interrupted. When the beam passed over the preparation tables, Diana could see that the 3 bodies she had been working on were still covered with white sheets, looking like ghostly forms in the harsh LED light. The beam stopped moving and focused on the table where James Mitchell's body had been prepared several days earlier. The intruder approached the table and began searching it thoroughly, running, his hands along the metal surface and checking the drains and equipment connections. He was looking for something specific, probably the fabric evidence that Diana had already removed. As the intruder continued his search, Diana heard something that made her question her own sanity. From somewhere in the darkness, barely audible above the sound of her own breathing, came a whispered voice. "Behind you," the voice said. "He's behind you." Diana turned around and saw nothing but darkness. The voice had sounded like it was coming from directly beside her, but there was no one there. She wondered if stress and fear were causing her to hallucinate, or if the building's acoustics were carrying sounds from other parts of the basement in unexpected ways. The flashlight beam moved away from James Mitchell's preparation table and began searching the area where Diana was hiding. She pressed herself against the cold concrete wall and tried to make herself as small as possible, but she knew that discovery was inevitable. The basement had too few hiding places, and the intruder was being thorough in his search. The refrigeration. "You knit," the whispered voice said again. "He can't see you there." This time Diana was certain that the voice was real and that it was trying to help her. She couldn't explain how someone was communicating with her in the darkness without being detected by the intruder, but she decided to trust the guidance. Moving as quietly as possible, she crawled toward the large refrigeration unit that kept the funeral home's bodies at the proper temperature. The space behind the refrigeration unit was cramped and uncomfortable, but it provided complete concealment. From the flashlight beam, Diana wedged herself into the narrow gap between the unit and the basement wall, trying to ignore the mechanical humming and the smell of coolant that permeated the area. From her new hiding place, she could see the intruder more clearly when his flashlight beam illuminated his own position. He was a tall, well-dressed man in an expensive suit, the kind of clothing that might be made from burgundy fabric. His movements were professional and confident, suggesting military or law enforcement training. More importantly, Diana recognized him. The intruder was Captain Robert Hayes, the Gary Police Department's highest-ranking detective and Detective Warren's direct supervisor. His presence in the funeral home confirmed that the corruption in the investigation of James Mitchell's death reached to the highest levels of local law enforcement. Captain Hayes completed his search of the preparation area and moved toward the storage rooms where the previous break-in had occurred. As soon as his flashlight beam disappeared around the corner, Diana heard the whispered voice again, much clearer this time. "You have to get out of here now," the voice said. "He's not just looking for evidence. He's here to eliminate witnesses." Diana still couldn't see who was speaking to her, but the urgency in the voice convinced her to move. She crawled out from behind the refrigeration unit and began making her way toward the basement stairs, using her memory of the room's layout to navigate in the darkness. She had almost reached the stairs when her foot caught on something that shouldn't have been there, what felt like an outstretched arm lying across her path. Diana bit back a scream and reached down to investigate what she had stumbled over. Her hands encountered cold skin and the unmistakable texture of a human body. But this wasn't one of the prepared corpses from the funeral home's refrigeration system. The body was warm, recently deceased, and wearing street clothes rather than a hospital gown or funeral attire. As Diana's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could make out the shape of a young man lying on the floor between the preparation tables. He appeared to have been shot multiple times in the chest, and there was a pool of blood spreading across the concrete floor beneath him. "That's going to be you if you don't move right now," the whispered voice said with increasing urgency. "He brought that body here to frame you for murder. You have to run." The realization hit Diana like a physical blow. Captain Hayes hadn't broken into the funeral home to search for evidence. He had come to plant evidence that would implicate her in another murder. The fresh corpse on the basement floor would be discovered along with the fabric samples she had taken from the previous victims, creating a narrative that portrayed her as a serial killer who used her job at the funeral home to cover her crimes. Diana began moving toward the stairs again, but her progress was interrupted by the sound of Captain Hayes returning from the storage area. His flashlight beam was sweeping back toward the preparation room, and she realized that he would discover her presence within seconds. "This way," the whispered voice said, and Diana felt a distinctly cold hand grip her wrist and pull her toward a different part of the basement. The touch was unmistakably real. She could feel individual fingers wrapped around her arm, guiding her through the darkness toward what appeared to be a ventilation grate near the building's foundation. The hand was cold enough to make her shiver, but it felt solid and purposeful, not like a hallucination or figment of her imagination. "Crawl through there," the voice instructed. "It leads to the storm drain system. You can get out through the parking lot." As Diana squeezed through the ventilation grate, she caught a glimpse of her mysterious guide in the reflected light from Captain Hayes's flashlight. The figure appeared to be a young man in his 20s, wearing the kind of casual clothes that delivery drivers typically wore for work. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but she could see enough to recognize the honest, hopeful features she had studied in James Mitchell's social media photos. James Mitchell was helping her escape from his own killer. The storm drain tunnel was narrow and filled with decades of accumulated debris, but it provided a route out of the building that Captain Hayes wouldn't think to monitor. Diana crawled through the muddy water and broken concrete, guided by James's whispered directions, until she reached a drainage outlet in the funeral home's parking lot. She emerged from the storm drain covered in mud and shaking from cold and terror, but alive and free. Behind her, she could see lights moving through the funeral home's windows as Captain Hayes continued his search for evidence and witnesses to eliminate. "You can't go home," James's voice warned her as she crouched beside the drainage outlet. "They're watching your apartment. You need to disappear until you can figure out how to expose what they've done." "How is this possible?" Diana whispered to the darkness around her. "How are you able to help me?" "Death isn't always the end," James replied, his voice growing fainter as dawn approached. "Sometimes people who die violently can linger long, enough to seek justice, but I can't stay much longer. You have to find a way to prove what Captain Hayes and Detective Warren have done, and you have to do it before they kill you too." As the first light of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, James Mitchell's presence faded completely, leaving Diana alone in the parking lot with mud-stained clothes, 2 pieces of fabric evidence, and the knowledge that she was now the primary target of a conspiracy that had already claimed multiple lives. The amateur investigation that had begun with curiosity and financial desperation had evolved into a fight for survival. Diana Martinez, The 19-year-old corpse washer from Gary, Indiana, was now the only person who could expose a murder conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement. But first, she had to stay alive long enough to find someone who would believe her story and act on the evidence she had gathered. In a city where the police were the killers and the dead were her only allies, that would prove to be the most challenging investigation of all. Diana spent the next 3 days living like a ghost in her own city. She slept in abandoned buildings, washed in public restroom sinks, and survived on vending machine snacks purchased with the small amount of cash she had been carrying when she fled the funeral home. Every police car that passed made her heart race, and every shadow seemed to conceal potential threats. On the 4th morning, she made her way to the Gary Public Library, using back streets and alleys, keeping her head down and trying to blend in with the homeless population that congregated in the downtown area. The library was one of the few places in the city where she could access a computer without providing identification, and she desperately needed to research the conspiracy that was hunting her. The librarian on duty was Mrs. Eleanor Chen, an elderly woman who had worked at the library for over 30 years and had developed a reputation for helping people who needed assistance but couldn't always ask for it directly. Mrs. Chen took one look at Diana's disheveled appearance and quietly directed her to a computer terminal in a corner where she would be less visible to other patrons. "Take as much time as you need, dear," Mrs. Chen said softly. "And there's a shower in the staff bathroom if you'd like to clean up." "I'll make sure you're not disturbed." Diana spent the next 4 hours using the library's internet connection to piece together a more complete picture of the corruption network that had killed James Mitchell and Patricia Gomez. What she discovered was far more extensive and sophisticated than she had imagined. Captain Robert Hayes had been with the Gary Police Department for over 20 years, rising through the ranks despite a series of complaints about excessive force and questionable investigative practices. His personnel file, which Diana accessed through a combination of public records requests and social media research, showed a pattern of cases that had been closed quickly with minimal investigation. More troubling, Captain Hayes had significant financial assets that seemed inconsistent with a police officer's salary. Property records showed that he owned 3 houses in upscale neighborhoods, 2 expensive boats, and a collection of luxury cars. His wife's social media accounts featured photos of exotic vacations and designer clothing that would have been impossible to afford on a civil servant's income. Detective Lisa Warren's financial situation was equally suspicious. Despite being a relatively junior detective, she had recently purchased a house worth over $400,000 and had been photographed at charity events wearing jewelry that probably cost more than her annual salary. Her bank records, which Diana found through a data breach that had exposed personal information for thousands of Gary residents, showed regular cash deposits that couldn't be explained by her official employment. But the most shocking discovery came when Diana began researching the businesses and organizations connected to the addresses where James Mitchell had made his special deliveries. The law firm that specialized in municipal contracts had been involved in negotiating several major development projects that had received federal funding despite questionable community needs. The real estate development company had a history of purchasing properties at below-market prices immediately before those areas were designated for urban renewal projects. The pattern suggested a sophisticated corruption scheme involving insider information, fraudulent development projects, and the systematic elimination of anyone who might expose the illegal activities. James Mitchell, Patricia Gomez, and the other victims had probably stumbled across evidence of the scheme through their various jobs, making them liabilities that needed to be eliminated. As Diana researched deeper into the network, she began to understand why Captain Hayes had been so desperate to recover the fabric evidence from the funeral home. The burgundy material wasn't just proof that the same person had killed multiple victims. It was a link to a specific individual who could be traced through DNA analysis, financial records, or other forensic evidence. The fabric appeared to be silk, probably from an expensive suit or jacket. The distinctive burgundy color and high quality suggested that it had been custom-made or purchased from a high-end retailer. If Diana could identify the specific manufacturer or retailer, she might be able to trace the fabric back to its original purchaser. She used the library's computer to search for local businesses that sold custom menswear or high-end clothing. Gary wasn't exactly a fashion capital, but there were several upscale stores in nearby Chicago that catered to wealthy professionals who needed expensive suits for business purposes. One store in particular caught her attention: Martinelli Brothers Custom Tailoring, a third-generation family business that specialized in handmade suits for Chicago's political and business elite. Their website featured photos of satisfied customers that included several recognizable politicians, judges, and business leaders. More importantly, their signature fabric collection included a burgundy silk that appeared to match the samples Diana had collected. Diana used the library's phone to call Martinelli Brothers, pretending to be a private investigator working on an insurance claim. She described the fabric samples and asked if the store had recently sold any garments made from similar material. "Oh, yes," the store's manager said enthusiastically. "That's one of our most popular fabrics for custom suits. We've made several garments from that material over the past year. It's a beautiful burgundy silk that we import exclusively from Italy." "Would it be possible to get a list of customers who have purchased suits made from that fabric?" Diana asked. "For insurance purposes, of course," the manager hesitated. "I'd have to check our records, and we're normally very protective of customer privacy. But if it's for a legitimate insurance investigation, I suppose I could provide some general information. Can you give me your contact information so I can verify your credentials?" Diana gave the manager a fake name and phone number, then hung up before the conversation could continue. She had learned enough to confirm that the fabric samples could potentially be traced to specific customers, but she would need a different approach to access that information without revealing her identity. As she prepared to leave the library, Diana heard a familiar voice whisper her name. She looked around, but saw only other library patrons quietly reading or working at computer terminals. The voice came again, more clearly this time. "There's someone watching you," James Mitchell's voice warned. "Dark blue sedan in the parking lot. You need to leave through the back exit." Diana glanced toward the library's front windows and saw the sedan James had mentioned. The vehicle was parked in a position that provided a clear view of the main entrance, and she could see at least 2 people inside. She couldn't identify the occupants from her position inside the building, but their presence confirmed that Captain Hayes and his associates were actively hunting for her. Following James's guidance, Diana made her way to the library's rear exit, which opened onto an alley that connected to several other downtown buildings. Mrs. Chen noticed her heading toward the back of the building and quietly handed her a small paper bag containing sandwiches and bottled water. "Be safe, dear," Mrs. Chen whispered, "and remember that there are people in this community who believe in doing the right thing, even when it's dangerous." The comment made Diana wonder how much Mrs. Chen knew about her situation. The librarian had been unusually helpful and accommodating, suggesting that she might have experience helping people who were in trouble with local authorities. Diana filed that information away for potential future use. She might need allies before her investigation was complete. The alley behind the library connected to a network of service roads that allowed Diana to move through downtown Gary without being seen from the main streets. James's presence seemed stronger in the shadows between buildings, and his voice provided constant guidance about potential threats and safe routes. "You're getting close to something important," James told her, as she navigated through a particularly narrow passage between two abandoned storefronts. "But you need more than fabric samples to bring down Captain Hayes and his network. You need documentary evidence, financial records, communication logs, something that proves the conspiracy extends beyond just a few corrupt cops." "How am I supposed to get that kind of evidence?" Diana whispered back. "I can't exactly walk into the police station and ask to see their files." "There's someone you can trust," James replied. "Agent Sarah Blackwood from the FBI's Chicago office. She's been investigating corruption in Gary for over a year, but she hasn't been able to find witnesses who were willing to testify. If you can get in touch with her and provide the evidence you've collected, she might be able to protect you while building a federal case." The suggestion both excited and terrified Diana. Contact with federal law enforcement could provide the protection and resources she needed to expose the conspiracy, but it would also make her a permanent target for Hayes's network. Once she became a federal witness, there would be no going back to her old life. "How do I know I can trust this FBI agent?" Diana asked. "Because she's the one person in law enforcement who isn't connected to the corruption network," James explained. "Hayes and Warren have been careful to keep their activities within local jurisdiction, but Agent Blackwood has federal authority that they can't control or influence." That evening, Diana used a payphone outside a convenience store to call the FBI's Chicago field office. She asked to speak with Agent Blackwood, claiming to have information about corruption in the Gary Police Department. After being transferred several times, she finally reached Agent Blackwood's voicemail and left a brief message asking for a meeting. 2 hours later, her burner phone rang with a call from an unknown number. "This is Agent Sarah Blackwood," the caller said. "I received your message about corruption in Gary. Are you calling about the Hayes investigation?" The fact that Agent Blackwood immediately knew which investigation Diana was referring to confirmed that the FBI was indeed looking into Captain Hayes's activities. "Yes," Diana replied. "I have physical evidence and witness testimony that could help your case, but I need protection. There are people trying to kill me." "Where are you now?" Agent Blackwood asked, her tone becoming more urgent. "Are you in immediate danger?" "I'm hiding in downtown Gary, but I don't know how long I can stay ahead of them. They've already killed at least 3 people that I know about, and they're trying to frame me for murder." Agent Blackwood was quiet for a moment, apparently considering the implications of what Diana had told her. "I can arrange to meet you in a secure location within the next few hours, but I need you to understand that once you become a federal witness, your life is going to change permanently." "Are you prepared for that?" "My life has already changed," Diana replied. "I just want to survive long enough to see justice for the people they've killed." Agent Blackwood gave Diana instructions to meet at a truck stop outside Gary, where federal agents could provide security while evaluating the evidence she had collected. The meeting was scheduled for midnight, giving Diana several hours to make her way to the location without being detected. As she walked through the industrial district toward the truck stop, Diana felt James's presence growing stronger. His voice was clearer now, almost as if he was walking beside her through the empty streets. "This is it," James said. "This is your chance to expose what they've done and prevent them from killing anyone else. But you need to be careful. Hayes and Warren are desperate now, and desperate people do unpredictable things." "What happens to you after I give this evidence to the FBI?" Diana asked. "Will you be able to rest or move on, or whatever it is that ghosts are supposed to do?" James was quiet for so long that Diana began to wonder if he had disappeared. Again, when he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness that made her chest tighten with emotion. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never been dead before. All I know is that I couldn't leave while my killer was still free and other people were in danger. Maybe once justice is served, I'll find out what comes next." The truck stop appeared ahead of them, its bright lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of safety. Diana could see several unmarked vehicles parked in the lot, and she spotted at least 2 people in business suits who were probably federal agents. For the first time in days, she began to believe that she might actually survive her investigation into James Mitchell's murder. What she didn't know was that Captain Hayes had been monitoring FBI communications for months, using equipment and contacts from his network of corrupt officials. He knew about Agent Blackwood's investigation, and he knew about the midnight meeting at the truck stop. As Diana walked toward what she hoped would be safety and justice, Hayes and his associates were already in position to eliminate both her and the federal agents who were trying to protect her. The final confrontation between the living and the dead, between corruption and justice, was about to begin in a truck stop parking lot outside Gary, Indiana. The fabric evidence in Diana's pocket would soon become the thread that either unraveled a conspiracy or disappeared forever, along with everyone who had tried to expose the truth. The truck stop's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the parking lot as Diana approached the designated meeting point. She could see Agent Sarah Blackwood standing beside a black SUV, speaking quietly into a radio while scanning the surrounding area. 2 other agents were positioned near the building's entrance, trying to appear casual while maintaining clear sight lines across the lot. Agent Blackwood was younger than Diana had expected, probably in her early 30s, with short blonde hair and the kind of alert, focused demeanor that suggested extensive field experience. She wore a dark business suit that looked practical rather than fashionable, and her posture indicated someone accustomed to potentially dangerous situations. "Are you the person who called about Captain Hayes?" Agent Blackwood asked as Diana approached the SUV. "Yes," Diana replied, glancing nervously around the parking lot. "Did you come alone?" Agent Blackwood gestured toward her colleagues near the building. "I brought backup for security purposes, but this conversation is just between us unless you decide to provide formal testimony. Why don't you tell me what you know about Hayes's operation?" Diana pulled the fabric samples from her pocket and handed them to Agent Blackwood. These came from 2 different murder victims that Hayes and Detective Warren covered up as street crimes. The same person killed both victims, and I think I can prove it. Agent Blackwood examined the fabric samples under the truck stop's bright lights. "Where exactly did you find these?" "I work nights at Whitmore Funeral Home, preparing bodies for burial. I found the first sample on James Mitchell, who was supposedly killed in a robbery. The second came from Patricia Gomez, whose murder was staged to look like a car accident. And you're certain these samples came from the same garment?" "Look at the tear patterns," Diana said, pointing to the edges of both pieces. "They match perfectly, like they were ripped from the same place during a struggle. I've also traced the fabric to a specific retailer in Chicago that makes custom suits for wealthy clients." Agent Blackwood's expression became more serious as she processed the implications of what Diana was telling her. "Have you shared this information with anyone else?" "No, but Hayes knows I have evidence. He broke into the funeral home looking for it, and when that didn't work, he tried to frame me for murder by planting a fresh body and making it look like I was the killer." "How do you know Hayes was personally involved in the break-in?" "Because I saw him," Diana replied. "I was hiding in the basement when he cut the power and searched the building with a flashlight. He's tall, well-dressed, and he moved like someone with military or police training." Agent Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "That's consistent with what we've learned about Hayes through our investigation. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Gary PD, and he has advanced training in surveillance and evidence recovery." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. 3 cars were entering the truck stop and parking lot simultaneously, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they moved to surround the area where Diana and Agent Blackwood were standing. "Those aren't our people," Agent Blackwood said quickly, reaching for her radio. "We need to move now." But before they could reach the SUV, spotlights blazed from all 3 approaching vehicles, temporarily blinding them and eliminating any chance of escape. Car doors slammed, and Diana could hear multiple sets of footsteps approaching their position. "Agent Blackwood," called a familiar voice from the darkness beyond the spotlights. "I think you have something that belongs to me." Captain Hayes stepped into the ring of light, flanked by Detective Warren and 2 other men Diana didn't recognize. All 4 were armed, their weapons drawn but held low in a gesture that was threatening without being overtly aggressive. "Captain Hayes," Agent Blackwood replied, her hand moving slowly toward her own weapon. "This is federal business. You have no jurisdiction here." Hayes laughed, a sound without humor that seemed to echo off the empty trucks parked around the lot. "Jurisdiction is a flexible concept when you're dealing with national security issues. The operation you're investigating involves federal contracts and interstate commerce, which makes it a matter of mutual interest." "What operation?" Agent Blackwood asked, though Diana could tell from her tone that she already suspected what Hayes was referring to. "The redevelopment projects that have brought millions of federal dollars into Gary over the past 5 years, Hayes explained. "Projects that have provided jobs, housing, and economic opportunities for thousands of people. Projects that could be jeopardized by misguided investigations based on incomplete information." Detective Warren stepped forward, her weapon now raised, and pointed directly at Diana. "The fabric samples you're carrying were stolen from active crime scenes. That makes you a thief and an accessory to obstruction of justice." "Those aren't active crime scenes," Diana protested. "You closed both cases and released the bodies for burial. The investigations were supposed to be complete." "Investigations are never truly complete," Hayes said. "New evidence can always emerge that requires us to re-examine our conclusions. Evidence like the samples you've been carrying around Gary for the past week." Agent Blackwood's backup agents had been moving quietly through the parking lot, trying to get into position to assist her, but Hayes's associates had anticipated their approach. Gunshots rang out from the far side of the lot, followed by radio chatter indicating that the federal agents had been neutralized. "Your backup isn't coming," Hayes told Agent Blackwood. "This is now a local law enforcement matter and you're outside your jurisdiction. I suggest you hand over any evidence you've collected and return to Chicago before this situation becomes more complicated than necessary." Agent Blackwood looked at Diana, then back at Hayes. "And if I refuse?" Hayes shrugged. "Then you become part of the problem instead of part of the solution. We've invested too much time and resources in our redevelopment initiatives to let them be destroyed by people who don't understand the bigger picture." "The bigger picture being your personal profit from fraudulent federal contracts?" Agent Blackwood asked. "The bigger picture being economic revitalization of one of America's most devastated cities," Hayes corrected. "Sometimes progress requires cutting through red tape and regulatory obstacles that prevent meaningful change. Our methods may not always conform to strict federal guidelines, but our results speak for themselves." Diana felt James Mitchell's presence growing stronger as the confrontation escalated. His voice whispered urgently in her ear, though she was careful not to react in a way that would alert Hayes to the ghostly communication. "The agent is wearing a wire," James told her. "Everything Hayes says is being recorded by federal equipment. He doesn't know it, but he's confessing to his crimes while being monitored by the FBI." The realization gave Diana hope that even if she and Agent Blackwood were killed, the evidence of Hayes's corruption would survive, but she also understood that Hayes wouldn't allow any witnesses to leave the truck stop alive once he realized how much they knew about his operation. What Happens to me if I give you the fabric samples, Diana asked Hayes. You go back to your life, Hayes replied. You continue working at the funeral home, you take care of your mother, and you forget about things that don't concern you. In return, I will make sure that your family's financial problems become more manageable. And James Mitchell, Patricia, Gomez, the other people you've killed? Hayes's expression hardened. Those people made poor decisions that put themselves and others at risk. They couldn't be trusted to keep information confidential, so they became liabilities that had to be addressed. You mean they had to be murdered? I mean, they had to be removed from situations where their continued presence threatened larger objectives, Hayes said. Sometimes individual sacrifice is necessary for community benefit. Agent Blackwood shook her head in disgust. You're talking about executing American citizens to cover up your theft of federal funds. There's no justification for that. There's justification for anything that serves the greater good, Hayes replied. The federal government has been promising to revitalize cities like Gary for decades, but their programs are inefficient and bureaucratic. We've found ways to make real change happen, and we're not going to let idealistic federal agents destroy what we've built. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Hayes trying to negotiate the return of evidence, while Agent Blackwood refused to cooperate with what she correctly identified as a criminal conspiracy. Diana could sense that the situation was approaching a violent resolution, and she began looking for opportunities to escape, or at least create a distraction that might give Agent Blackwood a tactical advantage. There's a drainage ditch behind the building, James whispered to her. If you can get there, you can follow it back toward the city and find help. But you need to move soon. Hayes is getting impatient. As if responding to James's observation, Hayes raised his weapon and pointed it directly at Agent Blackwood's chest. I'm done negotiating. Hand over the evidence, or both of you die right here. The evidence is already in federal custody, Agent Blackwood lied smoothly. Killing us. Won't change that. Hayes studied her face carefully, apparently trying to determine whether she was telling the truth. If that's the case, then you've just signed your own death warrant. Dead federal agents create too much attention, but sometimes that's a risk we have to take. The gunshot, when it came, was not from Hayes's weapon. Edmund Whitmore Jr. had been watching the confrontation from behind a parked semi-truck, and when he saw Hayes preparing to execute Agent Blackwood, he fired a single shot from a hunting rifle that dropped the corrupt police captain instantly. The parking lot erupted in chaos as Detective Warren and Hayes's associates scrambled for cover while returning fire toward Edmund's position. Agent Blackwood used the distraction to reach her SUV and retrieve additional weapons from the vehicle's cargo compartment. "Run!" James's voice shouted in Diana's ear. "This is your chance!" Diana sprinted toward the drainage ditch behind the truck stop, guided by James's directions and protected by the covering fire that Agent Blackwood was now laying down against Hayes's surviving associates. She could hear bullets whining overhead and ricocheting off concrete and metal surfaces, but she focused on reaching the relative safety of the drainage system. She had almost reached the ditch when she felt a sharp pain in her shoulder and realized that she had been shot. The wound wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was bleeding heavily and would make further escape more difficult. "Keep moving," James urged her. "Edmund and the agent can't hold them off much longer." As Diana lowered herself into the drainage ditch, she looked back toward the truck stop and saw Edmund Whitmore Jr. fall under sustained gunfire from Detective Warren's position. The funeral director had sacrificed his life to give her and Agent Blackwood a chance to escape, and his final act of courage had probably saved both their lives. The drainage ditch led away from the truck stop toward a network of industrial buildings and abandoned lots where Diana could hide until federal reinforcements arrived. Agent Blackwood's wire recording had captured Hayes's confession to multiple murders and federal fraud, providing the evidence needed to bring down the entire corruption network. But as Diana crawled through the muddy water of the drainage system, bleeding from her gunshot wound and guided by the voice of a dead man, she realized that her ordeal was far from over. Detective Warren and Hayes's other associates were still alive and hunting for her, and they would not give up until either she was dead or they were in federal custody. The final confrontation between the living and the dead was still ahead, and Diana Martinez was about to discover that some ghosts fight back with more than whispered warnings and guidance through the darkness. The abandoned chemical plant where Diana sought refuge had been closed for over a decade, its rusted machinery and broken windows testament to Gary's industrial decline. She pressed herself against a concrete pillar in the main processing facility, trying to stop the bleeding from her shoulder wound with strips torn from her shirt. The bullet had passed through without hitting bone, but she was losing blood faster than she could afford. "You're safe for now," James Mitchell's voice whispered, from the shadows between the massive steel tanks. "But Detective Warren is tracking you. She has experience hunting fugitives, and she won't give up easily." Diana could see flashlight beams moving through the plant's exterior, accompanied by the sound of vehicles and radio chatter. Warren had called for backup from other corrupt officers in Hayes's network, and they were conducting a systematic search of every building in the industrial complex. "How many people were involved in this conspiracy?" Diana asked James quietly. "More than you realize," he replied, his ghostly form becoming more visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Hayes wasn't just stealing federal money, he was running protection for drug operations, human trafficking networks, and illegal weapons sales. The redevelopment contracts were just the legitimate front that allowed him to launder money and explain his wealth. The revelation made Diana understand why Hayes had been willing to kill so many people to protect his operation. He hadn't just been covering up fraud. He had been protecting a criminal empire that generated millions of dollars annually through multiple illegal activities. "Warren was his lieutenant in the police department," James continued. "But there are others, judges, city council members, federal contractors, even some FBI agents who were paid to look the other way. This thing goes all the way to Washington." Through the broken windows of the processing facility, Diana could see Warren's search team moving methodically through the adjacent buildings. They had dogs now, and the animals were following her blood trail from the drainage ditch to the chemical plant. Discovery was inevitable unless she found a way to throw them off her scent. "There's an underground tunnel system that connects this plant to the steel mill next door," James told her. "The tunnels were built during World War II to move materials between facilities without being seen from the air. If you can reach the tunnels, you can get out of here before they find you." "Where are the tunnel entrances?" Diana asked. James pointed toward a heavy metal door, partially concealed behind a row of chemical storage tanks. "That door leads to the maintenance level. The tunnel entrance is about 50 feet down the main corridor, behind what looks like an electrical panel." Diana began making her way toward the door, moving carefully to avoid disturbing any debris that might create noise. Her shoulder was throbbing with each heartbeat, and she was beginning to feel lightheaded from blood loss, but adrenaline kept her focused on reaching the tunnel system. She had almost reached the door when Warren's voice echoed through the facility, amplified by a portable megaphone. "Diana Martinez," Warren called. "I know you're in here. Your blood trail ends at this building and my dogs have your scent. There's nowhere left to run." Warren's team had entered the main processing facility and was spreading out to cover all possible escape routes. Diana could hear their footsteps and radio communications getting closer to her position behind the storage tanks. "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself involved in," Warren continued. "Captain Hayes was protecting this community from threats you can't even imagine. The federal government doesn't care about cities like Gary. They write us off as lost causes and move their resources to places that are already successful." Diana reached the metal door and found it secured with a heavy padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. She looked around for something to use as a tool to break the lock, but the area had been stripped clean of anything valuable or useful. Hayes created opportunities for people who had been forgotten by the system, Warren said, her voice moving closer to Diana's hiding place. Yes, some of our methods were unconventional, but the results spoke for themselves. Crime was down, employment was up, and federal money was actually being used to help people instead of disappearing into bureaucratic waste. James appeared beside Diana, his ghostly form more solid and defined than she had ever seen it. "Let me help," he said, reaching toward the padlock. To Diana's amazement, James was able to manipulate physical objects with increasing strength. His fingers, though translucent, gripped the padlock and applied pressure that bent the metal hasp until it snapped. The lock fell to the concrete floor with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through the entire facility. "They heard that," Warren shouted. "Southeast corner, behind the storage tanks." Footsteps began running toward Diana's position as she pulled open the heavy metal door and found herself looking down a narrow staircase that descended into complete darkness. She could hear James behind her, though she couldn't see him in the blackness of the stairwell. "Straight ahead for about 30 feet, then turn right at the junction," James instructed. "The tunnel that leads to the steel mill is marked with a yellow stripe painted on the wall. The underground maintenance level was a maze of pipes, electrical conduits, and machinery that had been installed decades earlier and never properly maintained. Water dripped from corroded pipes, and the air smelled of rust, mold, and industrial chemicals that had probably been illegal even when the plant was operational. Behind her, Diana could hear Warren's team reaching the metal door and beginning their descent into the maintenance level. Their flashlights sent dancing beams of light through the darkness, creating confusing shadows that made navigation even more difficult. "She's down here somewhere," Warren called to her associates. "Spread out and check every corridor. She's bleeding and can't get far." As Diana moved through the underground tunnels, guided by James's directions, she began to understand that her ghostly companion was becoming more powerful as his need for justice intensified. He was no longer just providing information and warnings. He was actively intervening in the physical world to help her escape. "How are you able to do that?" she whispered, as they reached the junction James had mentioned. "I don't know," he admitted. "I can feel myself getting stronger as we get closer to exposing the truth about what they did. Maybe the closer I get to justice, the more I can affect the world of the living." The yellow stripe on the tunnel wall was faded, but still visible, and it led them through a series of increasingly narrow passages that seemed to have been carved directly through the bedrock beneath Gary's industrial district. The tunnel system was more extensive than Diana had imagined, with branches leading to multiple surface locations throughout the area. This network was used for more than just moving materials during the war, James explained as they walked. In recent years, Hayes and his people have been using these tunnels to move drugs, weapons, and people without being detected by legitimate law enforcement. That's how they managed to operate for so long without being caught. They reached what appeared to be the tunnel's end, a heavy steel door similar to the one they had entered through at the chemical plant. But when Diana tried to open it, she found that it was locked from the other side with what sounded like multiple deadbolts and security bars. "We're trapped," she said, feeling panic beginning to overwhelm her remaining strength. "No," James replied, his voice taking on a quality she hadn't heard before, anger and determination that seemed to make the air around them vibrate with energy. "Warren and her people are trapped down here with us." Before Diana could ask what he meant, she heard Warren's voice echoing through the tunnel system behind them, but now it sounded different, confused and frightened rather than confident and threatening. "Where are the other teams?" Warren was saying into her radio. "I'm getting no response from Units 2 and 3. Something's wrong up here." James's ghostly form began to glow with a pale light that illuminated the tunnel around them. "I'm not the only one who's been waiting for justice," he said. "Patricia Gomez is here, Marcus Rodriguez from the cemetery, Tyler Washington, the security guard they killed last spring, all of Hayes's victims who died violently. We're all here now." The temperature in the tunnel began to drop noticeably, and Diana could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The walls seemed to be moving, shifting and flowing like water, and she could hear voices, multiple voices, whispering in languages she didn't understand. Warren's radio communications became increasingly frantic as her backup team stopped responding, and strange phenomena began manifesting throughout the underground tunnel system. Equipment malfunctioned, flashlights died, without explanation, and the corrupt officers found themselves separated from each other in a maze that seemed to be changing its configuration. "What's happening to them?" Diana asked. "Justice," James replied simply. "They took our lives to protect their secrets, and now we're taking away their ability to escape the consequences of what they've done." The locked door in front of them suddenly swung open without anyone touching it, revealing a staircase that led up to the steel mill's abandoned foundry. James gestured for Diana to climb the stairs, his glowing form providing enough light to guide her way. As they ascended, Diana could hear Warren screaming behind them in the tunnels, though she couldn't make out specific words. The screams were followed by gunfire, then silence that was somehow more terrifying than the previous chaos. "Is she dead?" Diana asked. "She's experiencing exactly what her victims experienced in their final moments," James explained. "Fear, desperation, and the knowledge that no one is coming to help. Whether she survives depends on whether she can find the courage to confess her crimes and ask for forgiveness." They emerged from the underground system into the steel mill's main foundry, where massive furnaces and casting equipment stood silent and cold. Dawn was breaking over Gary, and the first rays of sunlight streamed through the foundry's skylights, creating dramatic patterns of light and shadow across the industrial landscape. Agent Sarah Blackwood was waiting for them, along with a full team of federal agents and paramedics. She had survived the truck stop shootout and had been tracking Diana's progress through the tunnel system using thermal imaging and other advanced surveillance equipment. "Are you all right?" Agent Blackwood asked, as paramedics began treating. "Diana's gunshot wound, I think so," Diana replied, looking around for James but finding only empty air and dancing sunlight. "What happened to Detective Warren and the others?" "We're still searching the tunnel system," Agent Blackwood said. "We found 3 bodies so far, Hayes's associates who were helping Warren track you. Warren herself is missing, but we'll find her eventually." As the paramedics loaded Diana into an ambulance for transport to the hospital, she felt a familiar presence beside her one last time. "Thank you," James Mitchell's voice whispered, fainter now but filled with peace rather than urgency. "The evidence you provided will bring down the entire network. Federal prosecutors are already filing charges against over 30 people, including judges, contractors, and politicians who were part of Hayes's operation." "What happens to you now?" Diana asked quietly, hoping the paramedics would think she was talking to them. "I don't know," James replied, his voice growing even fainter. "But I'm not afraid anymore. You gave me justice, and you saved other people from becoming victims. That's all I ever wanted." The presence faded completely as the ambulance pulled away from the steel mill, leaving Diana alone with her thoughts and the knowledge that she had survived an ordeal that had claimed multiple lives and exposed a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of government. 6 months later, Diana Martinez testified before a federal grand jury that issued indictments against 47 individuals involved in Captain Hayes's corruption network. The fraudulent redevelopment contracts were exposed, resulting in the recovery of over $60 million in stolen federal funds. Detective Lisa Warren was eventually found in the tunnel system, catatonic and unable to provide coherent testimony about her experiences underground. Diana used her reward money from the federal government to pay for her mother's medical treatment and to enroll in college, where she studied forensic science with the goal of becoming a criminal investigator. She never returned to work at the Whitmore funeral home, but she kept the small pieces of burgundy fabric that had started her investigation, not as evidence, but as a reminder that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. She never saw or heard from James Mitchell again, but sometimes, late at night when she was studying for exams or worrying about her future, she felt a presence beside her. Not frightening or demanding, but peaceful and encouraging, as if someone who had found justice was watching over those still fighting to find their own. 3 years after the trials that brought down Captain Hayes's corruption network, Diana Martinez stood in the pristine laboratory of the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office in Chicago, carefully examining tissue samples under a high-powered microscope. At 22, she had transformed from a desperate teenager washing corpses for survival money into a forensic science graduate student whose testimony had helped convict dozens of criminals and recover millions in stolen funds. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was once again working with the dead, but now she did so as a trained professional with the authority to speak for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. Her supervisor, Dr. Angela Rodriguez, had specifically requested Diana for the most challenging cases, those involving suspected police misconduct, government corruption, or organized crime connections. "What do you make of these fibers?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, joining Diana at the examination station, where she was analyzing evidence from a recent homicide. Diana adjusted the microscope's magnification and studied the sample more carefully. High-end silk blend, probably custom-made. The weave pattern suggests European manufacturing, likely Italian. This isn't something you'd find in a department store. Similar to the evidence you found in the Hayes case. Different fabric, but same quality level. Whoever killed this victim has expensive taste in clothing and either doesn't realize he's leaving evidence behind, or he's arrogant enough to think it doesn't matter. Dr. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Since joining the medical examiner's office, Diana had developed a reputation for noticing details that other investigators missed. Her unconventional background, including her experience as a teenage corpse washer and her role in exposing a major corruption scandal, had given her insights that traditional forensic training often overlooked. The case they were working on involved the death of Marcus Chen, a Chicago city inspector who had been found shot execution style in his car near Lake Michigan. The official police report suggested a carjacking gone wrong, but the forensic evidence told a different story. The victim had been restrained before being killed, and there were no signs that robbery had been the motive. More troubling, the investigating detective was Thomas Brennan, a 20-year veteran with the Chicago Police Department who had recently been transferred from narcotics enforcement to homicide. Diana's research into Brennan's background had revealed several cases where his investigations had been closed quickly with minimal follow-up, a pattern she recognized from her experience with Detective Warren in Gary. "Have you been able to contact the victim's family?" Diana asked Dr. Rodriguez. "His widow agreed to meet with us this afternoon. She claims Marcus had been receiving threats related to his work, but she didn't provide specifics when she spoke with Detective Brennan." That afternoon, Diana and Dr. Rodriguez met with Linda Chen at a coffee shop in Chicago's Chinatown district. Mrs. Chen was a small, nervous woman in her 50s who kept glancing around the cafe as if she expected to be watched or followed. "Marcus was scared," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. For the past 6 months, he'd been acting like someone was hunting him. He installed new locks on our house, started carrying a gun, and told me to vary my routes when I went shopping or visited friends. Did he tell you why he was frightened? Dr. Rodriguez asked gently. Mrs. Chen hesitated, apparently weighing whether to trust them with sensitive information. He discovered something at work that he said could get him killed. Something about city contracts being awarded to companies that didn't exist, or that existed only on paper. Diana felt a familiar chill of recognition. Fraudulent development contracts? I think so. Marcus said millions of dollars in federal money was being stolen through fake construction projects. Roads that were never built, buildings that were never renovated, environmental cleanup work that was never performed. The pattern was almost identical to what Captain Hayes had been doing in Gary, but on a much larger scale. Chicago received hundreds of millions in federal development funds each year, and if a significant portion of that money was being stolen through fraudulent contracts, the conspiracy would involve numerous city officials, contractors, and possibly federal agents. Did Marcus mention any specific names or companies? Dr. Rodriguez asked. He was working on a list, Mrs. Chen replied. Names of people he suspected were involved, documentation of contracts that looked suspicious, bank records showing unusual payment patterns. He kept everything hidden in a safety deposit box that only I can access. Diana and Dr. Rodriguez exchanged glances. If Marcus Chen had been killed because he was investigating a corruption network similar to the one in Gary, his research materials could provide the evidence needed to expose another major conspiracy. Would you be willing to share that information with federal authorities? Diana asked. Mrs. Chen looked around the cafe nervously. I'm scared that if I come forward, I'll end up like Marcus. But I also know that keeping quiet won't bring him back or prevent other people from being killed. After discussing security arrangements and witness protection options, Mrs. Chen agreed to meet with FBI agents the following week. She also provided Diana with Marcus's safety deposit box key and authorization to examine its contents as part of the official forensic investigation. That evening, Diana returned to her apartment in Chicago's University District, a small but comfortable space that she shared with her mother, who had made remarkable progress in overcoming her addiction with the help of proper medical treatment and therapy. Sarah Martinez now worked part-time at a community health clinic, using her experience with prescription drug abuse to help other patients navigate recovery. How was work today? Sarah asked as Diana settled at the kitchen table with case files and textbooks. Complicated, Diana replied. I think we've stumbled across another corruption network, similar to what happened in Gary, but potentially much larger. Sarah looked concerned. Are you sure you want to get involved in another investigation like that? The last one nearly got you killed. That's exactly why I have to get involved, Diana said. If I don't use what I've learned to help other victims, then James Mitchell and the others died for nothing. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Diana felt a familiar presence in the apartment. It wasn't James. His spirit had found peace after justice was served in the Hayes case, but rather a different energy that she had begun to notice around particularly challenging cases. Over the past 3 years, Diana had discovered that her experience communicating with James Mitchell had opened a door that couldn't be easily closed. She occasionally sensed the presence of other murder victims, particularly those whose deaths had been covered up or misclassified by corrupt officials. The abilities that had saved her life during the Gary investigation had evolved into a kind of forensic intuition that helped her identify cases where the official conclusions were wrong. She didn't advertise this supernatural assistance. Her colleagues and supervisors assumed that her insights came from careful observation and analytical thinking. But Diana knew that she was receiving guidance from sources that couldn't be explained by conventional forensic science. "Someone's trying to tell me something about the Marcus Chen case," she told her mother. "I think there are aspects of his death that weren't included in the police report." The next morning, Diana accompanied Dr. Rodriguez to the bank where Marcus Chen had maintained his safety deposit box. The box contained exactly what Linda Chen had promised: extensive documentation of fraudulent city contracts, suspicious financial transactions, and a network of companies that appeared to exist solely for the purpose of stealing federal development funds. But the most shocking discovery was a list of names that Marcus had compiled based on his investigation. The list included several Chicago City Council members, the deputy mayor, 3 federal contracting officers, and Detective Thomas Brennan, the same officer who was officially investigating Marcus's murder. "This is bigger than Gary ever was," Dr. Rodriguez said as they examined the documents. "If even half of these allegations are true, we're looking at a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of city and federal government." Among Marcus's papers was a detailed timeline showing how the corruption network had evolved over the past decade. What had started as simple bid rigging for small city contracts had expanded into a sophisticated operation involving federal agencies, organized crime connections, and systematic elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the scheme. Most troubling of all was Marcus's final entry, dated just 3 days before his death. "They know I'm investigating. Brennan called today asking questions about my research interests. I think someone in the FBI is feeding information to the network. Don't trust anyone in law enforcement until this is over." The warning sent chills through Diana as she realized that Marcus Chen might not be the first city employee who had tried to expose the conspiracy. If the network had been operating for over a decade and was sophisticated enough to have sources within federal law enforcement, there were probably other victims whose deaths had been successfully covered up. "We need to contact Agent Blackwood," Diana told Dr. Rodriguez. "She's the only federal agent I trust completely, and she has experience with corruption cases involving murdered witnesses." Agent Sarah Blackwood had been promoted to supervise the FBI's public corruption unit for the Midwest region, largely based on her success in the Hayes case. When Diana called her office, Agent Blackwood immediately recognized the significance of what they had discovered. Marcus Chen is the 3rd city inspector who has died under suspicious circumstances in the past 18 months. Agent Blackwood told them during a secure video conference later that day. "We've been investigating the other deaths, but we haven't been able to establish definitive connections between the victims." "What about Detective Brennan?" Diana asked. "Marcus's notes suggest that Brennan was part of the network that killed him." "Brennan has been on our watch list for over a year," Agent Blackwood confirmed. "We suspect he's been feeding information to organized crime figures, but we haven't been able to prove it. If Marcus Chen documented Brennan's involvement in the corruption network, that could give us the evidence we need for federal charges." The investigation that followed Marcus Chen's safety deposit box revelations unfolded much more quickly than the Gary case had. Agent Blackwood's team had learned from their previous experience, and they were able to coordinate simultaneous raids on multiple locations while maintaining operational security that prevented corrupt law enforcement officers from interfering. Diana played a crucial role in the investigation, using her forensic expertise to analyze evidence and her supernatural intuition to identify leads that might otherwise have been overlooked. She discovered that several of the supposedly accidental deaths of city employees over the past 5 years showed patterns of evidence tampering that suggested murder rather than accident or suicide. The breakthrough came when Diana was examining autopsy photographs from a case involving Jennifer Walsh, a city budget analyst who had allegedly committed suicide by jumping from her apartment balcony. The official investigation had concluded that Walsh was depressed about financial problems and had left no suicide note. But as Diana studied the crime scene photographs, she noticed something that the original investigators had missed. Caught in the victim's hair was a small fiber that appeared to be the same high-end silk she had found in Marcus Chen's case. The fiber was so small that it was barely visible in the photographs, but Diana's trained eye and supernatural guidance helped her identify the potential evidence. Jennifer Walsh didn't commit suicide, she told Agent Blackwood during their next secure conference. She was thrown from her balcony by the same person who killed Marcus Chen. The fiber evidence proves that both murders were committed by someone wearing expensive custom clothing. Agent Blackwood's team was able to obtain a court order to exhume Jennifer Walsh's body and conduct a new autopsy using more advanced forensic techniques. The examination revealed defensive wounds that had been missed during the original investigation, as well as additional fiber evidence that confirmed Diana's theory. With solid physical evidence connecting multiple murders, Agent Blackwood's investigation expanded to include federal charges under the RICO Act, which allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations rather than individual crimes. The evidence from Marcus Chen's safety deposit box provided the financial documentation needed to prove systematic corruption, while the forensic evidence from multiple murder victims established the violent enforcement methods used to maintain the conspiracy's secrecy. Detective Thomas Brennan was arrested during a coordinated raid that also targeted 12 other individuals involved in the corruption network. Unlike the Gary case, where Captain Hayes had died during the final confrontation, the Chicago investigation resulted in arrests and prosecutions that exposed the full scope of the criminal organization. The trials that followed were among the largest public corruption cases in Chicago's history. Diana testified as an expert witness in multiple proceedings, helping prosecutors explain how the forensic evidence proved systematic murder and cover-up activities. Her testimony was particularly compelling because she could speak from personal experience about how corruption networks operated and how they eliminated threats to their operations. The convictions that resulted from the investigation led to the recovery of over $200 million in stolen federal funds and resulted in prison sentences for 37 defendants, including city officials, federal contractors, and several law enforcement officers. But for Diana, the most meaningful result of the investigation was the closure it provided to families who had never understood what had really happened to their loved ones. Jennifer Walsh's parents finally learned that their daughter had been murdered for trying to expose corruption, not driven to suicide by personal problems. Marcus Chen's widow could find some peace in knowing that her husband's death had meaning, and that his research had ultimately achieved the justice he had died seeking. On the 3-year anniversary of James Mitchell's death, Diana visited the cemetery where he was buried. She brought fresh flowers and a copy of the Chicago Tribune article describing the convictions in the corruption case that had claimed Marcus Chen and Jennifer Walsh. "I hope you can see what your guidance helped accomplish," she said quietly. "To James's headstone, the evidence you helped me find in Gary started something that saved dozens of lives and recovered hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen money." As she prepared to leave the cemetery, Diana felt a familiar presence. Not James this time, but Marcus Chen and Jennifer Walsh, the victims whose death she had helped expose and whose killers were now facing justice. "Thank you," Marcus's voice whispered in the wind, rustling through the cemetery trees. "We can rest now." Jennifer's presence added her own gratitude. "Others will be safe because of what you've done." As their spirits faded into peaceful silence, Diana realized that her work was far from over. Across the country, there were other corruption networks, other murdered witnesses, other families seeking answers about loved ones who had died under suspicious circumstances. Her unique combination of forensic training and supernatural guidance had given her the ability to speak for the dead in ways that conventional investigators couldn't match. Walking back toward her car in the cemetery parking lot, Diana Martinez, the former teenage corpse washer from Gary, Indiana, smiled as she thought about the cases waiting for her attention at the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. She had learned that death wasn't always the end, that justice could transcend the boundary between the living and the dead, and that sometimes the most important evidence came from sources that couldn't be explained by science but could change the world through truth. The dead had taught her that every life had value, every murder demanded justice, and every truth deserved to be told. As long as there were victims who needed someone to speak for them, Diana would be listening for their voices and working to ensure that their stories were heard by the living who had the power to act on their behalf. In a world where corruption seemed to multiply like cancer, she had become an antibody, carrying the voices of the dead to fight for justice among the living, one case at a time, one truth at a time, one soul at a time. 6 months after the Chicago convictions, Diana received an unexpected phone call that would lead her into the most complex case of her career. The caller was Rebecca Torres, a federal prosecutor from Phoenix, Arizona, who had been following Diana's work through law enforcement channels. "We have a situation here that matches the patterns you've identified in Gary and Chicago," Torres explained during their initial conversation. "Multiple deaths of government employees, investigations that were closed too quickly, and evidence of systematic fraud involving federal infrastructure projects. The Phoenix case involved the construction of a new international airport terminal that had received over $500 million in federal funding. According to Torres, at least 6 people connected to the project had died under suspicious circumstances over the past 2 years, including 2 FAA inspectors, a construction foreman, an environmental compliance officer, and 2 federal auditors. The deaths have been classified as everything from heart attacks to car accidents to suicides," Torres continued. "But when we started looking at the financial irregularities in the airport project, we realized that all 6 victims had been in positions where they might have discovered evidence of fraud or safety violations." Diana agreed to consult on the Phoenix case, bringing her unique combination of forensic expertise and supernatural sensitivity to bear on what appeared to be another large-scale corruption conspiracy. The case would require her to travel extensively and work with law enforcement agencies across multiple states, but she was drawn to the challenge of exposing another network of criminals who believed they could murder their way to wealth and power. The Phoenix investigation revealed that the airport corruption network had connections to similar schemes in Las Vegas, Denver, and Albuquerque. Federal infrastructure projects across the Southwest were being used as vehicles for massive fraud, with safety inspectors and auditors being systematically eliminated when they discovered evidence of substandard construction or missing materials. What made this case particularly dangerous was the involvement of international organized crime syndicates that had infiltrated legitimate construction companies and federal contracting processes. Unlike the relatively localized corruption in Gary and Chicago, the Southwest Network had resources and connections that extended far beyond traditional law enforcement jurisdiction. During her first week in Phoenix, Diana examined the body of David Kumar, one of the FAA inspectors who had allegedly died of a heart attack while inspecting electrical systems in the new terminal. The official autopsy had found no evidence of foul play, but Diana's examination revealed microscopic injection sites that suggested Kumar had been poisoned with a substance that mimicked the symptoms of cardiac arrest. More disturbing was the presence she felt around Kumar's body, a restless, angry energy that suggested his death had been particularly traumatic and that his spirit was seeking justice with unusual intensity. When Diana touched Kumar's personal effects, she experienced flashes of his final moments that revealed he had been lured to an isolated area of the construction site and murdered by someone he knew and trusted. "They're using more sophisticated methods now," she told Rebecca Torres after completing her examination. "The killers in Phoenix have access to exotic poisons and professional assassination techniques that weren't present in Gary or Chicago. This network has international connections and resources that make them far more dangerous than anything I've encountered before." The investigation that followed would span 18 months and involve cooperation between FBI offices in 6 different states. Diana found herself working alongside federal agents, international law enforcement officers, and forensic specialists from around the world as they unraveled a conspiracy that had been operating for over a decade. The breakthrough came when Diana's supernatural abilities led her to discover evidence hidden in the most unlikely location: the personal belongings of victims that had been returned to their families and scattered across multiple states. By visiting the families of all 6 Phoenix victims, she was able to piece together a pattern of evidence that revealed the full scope of the international conspiracy. Each victim had been investigating different aspects of the same massive fraud scheme. The FAA inspectors had discovered that critical safety systems in multiple airports were built with substandard materials that could fail catastrophically during emergency situations. The construction foreman had identified structural defects that could result in terminal collapses during earthquakes or severe weather. The federal auditors had traced financial irregularities that revealed hundreds of millions in stolen funds. But what none of the individual victims had realized was that they were all investigating the same criminal organization, an international syndicate that had infiltrated federal contracting processes across multiple agencies and geographic regions. The syndicate's leaders had been systematically eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their operations, using increasingly sophisticated assassination methods to avoid detection by law enforcement. The final confrontation with the Phoenix network took place not in abandoned buildings or underground tunnels, but in the boardrooms and federal courthouses where white-collar criminals preferred to conduct their business. The syndicate's leaders were arrested during coordinated raids in 7 countries, resulting in one of the largest international organized crime prosecutions in FBI history. Diana's testimony in the Phoenix trials helped convict 43 defendants on charges ranging from fraud and conspiracy to murder and international racketeering. The recovered evidence led to safety inspections that prevented potential disasters at airports, bridges, and federal buildings across the Southwest, potentially saving thousands of lives. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the Phoenix investigation was the closure it provided to families who had spent years wondering why their loved ones had died suddenly and under suspicious circumstances. David Kumar's widow finally learned that her husband had died as a hero, trying to prevent construction defects that could have killed airline passengers. The families of the other victims received similar revelations that transformed their grief into pride and their confusion into understanding. As Diana prepared to return to Chicago after the Phoenix trials concluded, she reflected on how far she had traveled from her desperate teenage years washing corpses in Gary's funeral homes. She had become one of the country's leading experts on corruption-related murders, consulted by law enforcement agencies around the world, and credited with helping to recover over $1 billion in stolen federal funds. But more importantly, She had learned that her unique abilities came with a responsibility to use them in service of justice and truth. The voices of murder victims continued to guide her work, providing insights that conventional forensic science couldn't match and helping to ensure that no death was ignored or forgotten. Standing in the Phoenix airport terminal that had been the center of so much corruption and violence, Deanna felt the presence of all the victims whose deaths she had helped expose. James Mitchell, Patricia Gomez, Marcus Chen, Jennifer Walsh, David Kumar, and dozens of others whose names were now inscribed on the permanent record of justice served. Their whispered voices had become a chorus of gratitude and peace, confirming that death was indeed not always the end, and that sometimes the most important work was done by those who could hear the voices that others couldn't perceive. As long as there were victims who needed someone to speak for them, Deanna Martinez would be listening, investigating, and ensuring that truth prevailed over corruption, one case at a time, one soul at a time. The teenage girl who had once washed corpses for $17 a night had become a guardian of the dead and a champion of justice, proving that sometimes the most unlikely people could change the world simply by refusing to let the voices of the murdered be silenced by those who had killed them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.